the knock that echoed through time. The streets of Malibu were quiet that morning, wrapped in a soft ocean mist that blurred the line between sea and sky. A calm stillness hovered over the waves as if the world was holding its breath. Somewhere in that mist, down a winding cobblestone path guarded by overgrown vines and bougainvillea, sat a weathered wooden door. Behind it, Sandra Bullock. She had come to this secluded coastal retreat not for peace but for escape. Fame had always cast a long shadow, especially when grief followed closely behind it. A year had passed since her mother's passing, yet the silence in her life had only grown louder. The tabloids called her absence a career break. Friends called it a well-deserved pause. But Sandra knew it was neither. It was survival. The world thought it knew her, the glamorous actress, the red carpet smile, the philanthropic darling, but no one really knew what it felt like to lose the one person who had seen her beyond the spotlight. And in that hidden Malibu house, the one her mother once told her to buy in case you ever need to hide from the world, she waited. For what she didn't know. Until a knock came. It wasn't forceful, it wasn't loud, but it was certain, as if the person behind it knew that this door had been waiting to be knocked on. Sandra froze mid-step in the hallway, coffee cup in hand. Her mind flickered with anxiety. Was it paparazzi? A fan who had tracked her down, or perhaps a delivery mistake? But when she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. It was Keanu Reeves. And he looked just as surprised to see her. 15 hours earlier, Los Angeles. Keanu hadn't intended to end up at her doorstep. He'd been driving along the Pacific Coast Highway, letting the miles blur past him like memories he didn't want to revisit. After finishing a low-key film project in New York, he had returned to LA only to be greeted by a sense of aching emptiness. There was no premiere party, no interviews, just quiet. Too much quiet. Grief had changed him. Not just the recent passing of his longtime friend and stunt double, but the cumulative weight of losses over the years. His daughter, Jennifer. His partner, Syme, the friends he buried. The silences that followed. He had grown accustomed to solitude, but solitude never quite got used to him. So when an old letter from his past fell out of a book, a letter his mother had written to him decades ago, reminding him of the people who brought light back into his life, one name echoed louder than all others. Sandra. They hadn't spoken in a while. Not really. Sure, they crossed paths at events and sent the occasional text or holiday card, but they hadn't truly connected in years. And yet, every time they had, every film, every unexpected dinner, every laugh, it had felt like coming home. That morning he had no plan, only a pull, something invisible but undeniable. He drove without a destination, only to find himself turning off into a winding road that looked strangely familiar. And then he saw the mailbox. Bull. He stopped and knocked. Back to present Malibu. Sandra stared at him as if he were a ghost, then slowly her lips parted into a confused smile. Keanu. He gave a hesitant smile. Hey, I wasn't sure this was still your place. It is, she replied, gripping the edge of the door. What are you doing here? I don't know, he said honestly. I was just driving and this is where I ended up. The honesty in his voice disarmed her. She stepped aside. You want to come in? He nodded. And just like that, two souls, both wounded, both weary, found themselves in the quiet presence of the only person who truly understood what it meant to live under the weight of a public smile and a private storm. The fire rekindled. Inside, they didn't speak at first. Sandra poured another cup of coffee, adding an extra sugar, just the way Keanu used to take it when they worked together on Speed. He smiled at the gesture. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was familiar, like a favorite song that didn't need lyrics. I always thought about calling, Sandra admitted, breaking the silence. But I didn't know if you wanted to talk. Keanu shook his head gently. I always wanted to, just didn't know how to say what I felt. Same. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, not romantic yet, not friendship either. Something deeper. Like two people who had walked through different hells, only to meet again in the same field of ash. I miss laughing, Keanu said almost to himself. Sandra smiled, soft and warm. You used to be good at that. You made it easy. And then came the rain. Later that evening, a soft rain began to fall, brushing against the windows like whispers of memory. Keanu stayed, not out of politeness, but out of necessity. The storm outside echoed the ones inside them both. They cooked a simple dinner together, grilled vegetables, some pasta, and a bottle of wine neither of them finished. Every movement in the kitchen was like a dance from a forgotten film. Her laugh returned. His eyes softened. The moments felt stolen from another life, one they never got to live. As night fell, Sandra showed him the guest room, but he didn't sleep. Neither did she. And when dawn broke over the ocean, lighting the sky in shades of gold and lavender, Keanu stood on the porch, coffee in hand, staring at the sea. Sandra joined him, wrapped in a blanket. "You think this means something?" she asked. He looked at her, truly looked at her. "I think it means everything." The morning after silence. The sun that rose over Malibu that morning was gentle, as if hesitant to break the rare tranquility inside Sandra Bullock's hidden seaside home. The waves outside whispered in rhythmic hushes, as though trying not to interrupt what had become a moment of quiet rediscovery. The air carried that fresh ocean scent, salt, seaweed, and the lingering promise of something new. But inside, the stillness between two people, once close, now strangers reintroduced, felt as delicate as glass, not yet broken, not yet defined. Sandra stood barefoot on the wooden deck, wrapped in a long gray cardigan, her fingers curled around a warm mug as her eyes followed the slow movement of Keanu's frame leaning on the railing. He hadn't changed much in appearance, still tall, quietly powerful, the kind of presence that didn't fill a room with noise but with depth. His hair had flecks of gray now, and his beard had grown in, slightly unkempt, but it suited him. What had changed, however, was something less visible but more present, an aura of weariness behind his eyes, a softness that came only after surviving battles no one else could see. She didn't say anything at first. Neither did he. Words would have ruined the comfort of that morning. For both of them, the noise of the outside world was always too loud. Directors shouting, cameras flashing, questions being hurled by strangers asking about their lives as if reading headlines gave them access to their hearts. But here, in this quiet coastal cocoon, they didn't need to perform. Eventually, Sandra broke the silence with a chuckle that surprised even herself. "It feels like we're in one of those indie films you used to do, two sad actors hiding from the world, trapped in a house with too much silence and just enough emotional baggage to make things awkward." Keanu's lips curled into a slow, amused smile. "Only this time we don't have a script." "Yeah, well," she said, sipping her coffee, "I think we're better without one." They both stared ahead, letting the silence return, not out of discomfort, but out of mutual understanding. Some conversations were best held between silences, and theirs was already saying everything. Later that morning, Keanu helped her in the kitchen, and it felt surprisingly normal. They moved like two people who had once known each other deeply and were now rediscovering the choreography. She would reach for the knife, and he'd already handed it. He stirred the eggs while she prepared toast. When he tried to cut vegetables, she smacked his hand away and took over, laughing when he pretended to be offended. "Still terrible with knives," she teased. "Still bossy," he replied. But beneath the jokes, there was a deeper current flowing. These weren't just old friends reconnecting. They were two people standing at the edge of something neither of them could name, something they didn't want to ruin by naming it too soon. As they ate breakfast together, Keanu finally brought up what had been swirling in his mind since the knock on her door. "I didn't mean to end up here, you know. I wasn't planning to interrupt your life." Sandra shook her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "You didn't interrupt it," she said after a moment. "You reminded me I still have one." He looked down at his plate, the weight of her words hanging heavy between them. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. "After the last film wrapped, I came back home and everything just felt empty, like I was pretending to still care, about roles, about Hollywood, even about myself." She didn't speak for a long while. When she finally did, her voice carried a mix of empathy and ache. "I know that feeling. I've been living it for the past year. After my mom passed, I started asking myself why I was still running so hard, what I was chasing. Awards, approval, relevance. I realized I didn't even like who I became when the cameras stopped." Keanu leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes locked on hers. "So what now?" Sandra looked toward the sea. "Maybe it's not about running anymore. Maybe it's about slowing down. Maybe it's about choosing peace instead of proving something." A gust of wind rattled the chimes hanging by the window, like punctuation to her thought. They spent the rest of the morning walking along the shore, the tide tugging gently at their ankles as they shared stories not meant for interviews or social media. Keanu told her about his motorcycle accident 2 years ago, how it wasn't reported by the press, but how it had shaken something loose in him. I thought I was fine, until I realized I hadn't let anyone in since a long time. Sandra opened up about her son and daughter, how parenting had become the one anchor keeping her from floating away. They remind me who I am, not Sandra the actress, just Mom, and that's what keeps me breathing. Their footsteps left parallel prints in the wet sand, two trails side by side, not yet intertwined but unmistakably connected. At one point, they stopped to rest on a washed-up log, the sun now high enough to warm their backs. Keanu looked over and asked, "Do you ever think we missed our timing?" Sandra raised an eyebrow. "You mean us?" He nodded slowly. "We were close, then distant, then close again, always dancing around something." She considered it for a long moment. Maybe we were never supposed to be something then. Maybe we were being prepared for now. That answer lingered in the air, unsaid but fully heard. By late afternoon, they returned to the house, both somehow changed. The house, once a sanctuary of solitude, was now slowly filling with laughter, footsteps, and the beginning sounds of music again. Keanu found her old record player in the corner, dusted off a Fleetwood Mac vinyl, and let the warmth of Stevie Nicks' voice fill the rooms. They danced not intimately but freely, like two people shaking off the dust of past lives. Evening arrived like a soft sigh. They had dinner outside, string lights glowing above them, casting a golden hue over the table. Sandra cooked, Keanu set the table. Everything felt simple, unstaged, free. But later that night, after the dishes were done and the music faded into silence, Keanu asked a question that shifted the tone. "Do you think people like us, people who have been broken, stitched back together, and then cracked again, can ever truly fall in love without fear?" Sandra turned to face him, her eyes reflecting both pain and hope. "Maybe that's what real love is, choosing to stay anyway." He nodded slowly. "And if we already have?" She didn't answer, not with words, but she didn't walk away either. By the time the moon rose high above the ocean, the two sat in silence again, this time side by side on the porch, shoulders nearly touching, hearts finally starting to speak in a language only the two of them could understand. And while the world kept turning beyond those waves, in that quiet house by the sea, two lives, once on parallel paths, were finally beginning to converge. The door that had once been knocked on, by chance, was no longer a doorway to the past. It was the threshold to everything that could still be. A letter beneath the floorboards. 3 days had passed since Keanu Reeves knocked on the weathered wooden door of Sandra Bullock's Malibu hideaway. 3 days filled with quiet sunrises, long ocean walks, imperfect meals, and silent understandings. It was as though time had melted into something slower, more deliberate, something that neither of them had experienced in years. No managers, no press, no red carpets, just breath, just presence. Yet in the comfort of their shared stillness, a question slowly began to rise like a tide neither of them could resist. How long before the world knocked again? The morning had begun like the ones before it, with Keanu up first, barefoot in the kitchen making coffee, as Sandra appeared yawning and wrapped in a robe, teasing him for always forgetting the cinnamon she liked. They had fallen into a rhythm without ever agreeing to it, an unspoken partnership that grew with each shared chore, each glance across the table, each laugh that lingered just a little longer than necessary. But on that particular morning, something unexpected broke the pattern. Sandra had been reorganizing the small bookshelf in the hallway when a creaky floorboard shifted beneath her foot. She paused, narrowing her eyes at the spot. The house was old, filled with quirks and secrets. She bent down and carefully removed the board, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Dust filled the air. Nestled inside was a yellowing envelope with faded handwriting she recognized instantly. Her breath caught. It was her mother's handwriting. The letter was addressed simply, "To my daughter when the silence finally speaks." Her hands trembled as she opened it, the scent of time and ink rushing into her senses. Keanu walked in from the kitchen just as she unfolded the fragile paper, and though she didn't speak, her expression made him pause in his tracks. Without saying a word, he sat beside her on the floor. She began to read. "My dearest Sandy, if you're reading this, then I know you've reached that point in life where the world has gone too quiet to distract you. The silence doesn't lie. It reveals. And in it, you'll find truths you've avoided, fears you've buried, and love you've denied yourself. I hid this letter here because I knew one day you'd need to find it without being told to look. You've always been strong, stronger than anyone gave you credit for, but strength doesn't mean isolation. It's okay to lean on someone. It's okay to let someone in, even if the world sees it as weakness. You've spent so long being the pillar for everyone else. Let someone be your soft place to land. And if by some miracle Keanu is there, if life has brought him back to your door, don't overthink it. Trust the timing. Trust your heart. Love doesn't always come wrapped in declarations and fireworks. Sometimes it comes in the form of a knock, soft, unsure, but real. Sandra couldn't read any further. Her hands dropped into her lap, and tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Keanu didn't move, didn't speak. He simply reached out, took her hand, and held it with the steadiness of someone who had learned to hold broken things without trying to fix them. For a long time, they sat like that, not as actors, not as icons, but as two people who had been navigating life's storms alone, now sheltering in the calm of each other's presence. Later that day, Sandra placed the letter on the mantel, a reminder not just of her mother's wisdom, but of the divine choreography of life. Because what were the odds that Keanu would knock on her door at the exact moment she needed someone to walk through it? The next few days unfolded differently. There was more openness now, more vulnerability. Keanu shared stories he had never told anyone, about the loneliness of hotel rooms after filming, about the night he sat in a diner for 6 hours because he didn't want to go home to silence, about how he sometimes wondered if the version of himself people loved was only a ghost he had created to survive. Sandra listened, not with pity, but with presence. She, too, peeled back layers, talking about the guilt she carried for missing her mother's last call, the fear that her children would grow up watching her chase meaning in places that couldn't offer it, the aching desire to be seen for more than what the world projected onto her. And in those long, quiet conversations, something began to grow, not romance in the traditional sense, not yet, but intimacy. A soul-level connection that was too pure to be rushed, too sacred to be labeled. One night, as they sat by the fireplace wrapped in blankets, Sandra turned to him and asked, "What would you do if the world disappeared tomorrow?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "I'd be okay if I was here, with you, watching the ocean, listening to music, maybe learning how to cook something other than scrambled eggs." She laughed softly, and in that laughter was healing. The power went out later that night, a storm offshore knocking out the grid, and they lit candles and played board games by the flickering light. At one point, Keanu pulled out an old guitar from the corner of the living room, one Sandra had forgotten even existed. He strummed softly, singing bits of a melody she didn't recognize. She asked what it was. "Something I wrote years ago," he said, eyes never leaving the strings. "I never finished it." "Why not?" "Because I didn't know how it ended, but I think I do now." She didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to. That weekend, a delivery arrived unexpectedly, a stack of scripts from Sandra's agent. She hadn't checked in months, but apparently a new indie director wanted her for a role in a project about grief, healing, and second chances. She smiled at the irony. Keanu encouraged her to read it. "Maybe it's the story you're ready to tell," he said. She handed him the script. "Read it with me." They sat on the couch, passing pages back and forth, voices trading lines, laughter erupting at awkward dialogue, tears welling at moments that hit too close to home. When they finished, they looked at each other in silence, not as co-stars, but as people who had just stepped into something deeply honest. Sandra folded the last page. "It's not just a film, it's everything we've been talking about." Keanu nodded. "Then maybe we're not just actors anymore, maybe we're the story." She stared at him for a long time, her heart thudding, her mind racing with the same fears she had buried for years. And yet, for the first time, she didn't feel the need to retreat from them. That night after Sandra went to bed, Keanu stayed up, standing alone on the deck, eyes tracing the horizon as the ocean whispered like a lullaby. He took out his phone and began typing a note, not a message, not a script, just a letter. To her. He didn't know if he would ever give it to her, but he wrote it anyway. "Sandra, you once told me you were afraid to fall in love again because every time you did, something was taken from you. But what if love isn't about possession? What if it's about presence? I don't want to take anything from you. I want to walk beside you in silence, in joy, in grief, in laughter. I want to be the knock you never expected but always needed. No pressure, no timelines, just this: I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." He saved the note, locked his phone, and walked back inside. As he passed the bookshelf in the hallway, he glanced down at the floorboard Sandra had lifted days before. And for the first time in a very long time, He felt like he wasn't standing on shaky ground anymore. He was home. The unspoken door. The Malibu sun rose with more color that morning, not just golden but laced with hues of pink and orange, as though nature itself sensed the subtle transformation unfolding inside the weathered beach house that had once been silent, still, and aching. The winds carried whispers of change, and inside the house, Keanu Reeves stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out 2 mugs with absent-minded rhythm while Sandra Bullock sat curled on the living room couch, thumbing through the script that had arrived days earlier. They had built something here, a sanctuary between moments, stitched together from laughter, shared silence, and vulnerability. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And real, they had learned, was so rare in their world that when it arrived, it felt almost frightening. "I keep thinking about the last line in the script," Sandra said, breaking the stillness. Her voice carried across the room like a thought turned into sound. "The one where the woman says, 'Some doors don't open with keys. They open when your heart finally stops trying to protect you from feeling.'" Keanu paused, turned off the faucet, and leaned on the counter, drying his hands slowly. "You think that's true?" "I didn't used to," she answered without looking up. "But now I wonder if I've spent years locking doors I should have left open." He crossed the room and sat beside her, their knees brushing. "We've both been scared, but I think being here with you, it's the first time I've stopped running from silence. And maybe, just maybe, it's the first time silence actually started answering back." Sandra closed the script and placed it gently on the coffee table. She turned to him, eyes searching his face not for charm or assurance, but for truth. "So what do we do with this?" she asked softly, gesturing vaguely between them. "With what's starting to grow here?" Keanu exhaled, not out of hesitation, but release. "We protect it. We let it breathe. We don't force it to become anything before it's ready, but we also don't ignore it." That answer seemed to settle the unspoken tension, yet at the same time, it revealed just how delicate their moment had become. Their connection was like a flame, not roaring, not flickering, but steady. And steady things, though often underestimated, carry the deepest heat. They decided to take a drive that afternoon, something simple, something grounding. Sandra had an old vintage convertible she hadn't driven in years, tucked under a dusty tarp in the garage. Keanu helped her push it out onto the driveway, laughing when the tires squealed and the engine sputtered before roaring to life like an old friend. With sunglasses on, hair whipping in the wind, they cruised along the Pacific Coast Highway with no destination in mind, only movement, only being. They stopped at a small, overlooked diner on the edge of a cliff where time seemed to have forgotten the walls. Inside, the walls were covered in photographs from the 1950s and 60s, lovers dancing, children licking ice cream, old men playing chess under faded umbrellas. It was simple. It was beautiful. It was everything Hollywood wasn't. Over black coffee and grilled cheese sandwiches they talked. Not about their careers, not about the industry, but about dreams, about regrets, about what came after fame, the hunger that stayed when the applause faded, and the kind of peace that could only be found in the unflashy corners of life. Keanu shared something he had never told anyone. "When I was younger," he said, stirring his coffee, "I used to think love was supposed to feel like thunder, explosive, loud. But the older I get, the more I realize maybe real love is just the quiet certainty that you're safe with someone, that you don't have to be more than you are." Sandra's eyes softened, and her smile came slowly, beautifully. "That's how I feel when I'm with you." The words hung in the air, not heavy, not scary, but sacred. They sat in silence for a long time after that. Outside, the sea crashed against the cliffs, and the sun began its slow descent, casting a honey glow over everything it touched. When they returned to the car, Sandra handed Keanu the keys. "You drive." He smirked, "Trusting me with your vintage convertible, that's big." "I trust you with more than that," she said, settling into the seat. The drive back felt different, calmer, like the road itself had slowed down just for them. That night, Sandra couldn't sleep. Something had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that made her heart flutter with both fear and possibility. She got up and walked down the hallway, past the bookshelf, past the creaky floorboard, past the place where her mother's letter still sat on the mantel. Keanu was already on the porch, sitting under the stars, wrapped in the same blanket he'd used every night. He didn't turn around when she approached. He didn't need to. "I was thinking about something you said," she began. "About not forcing this into something too soon, but I also think we need to be honest with ourselves." He nodded slowly, turning to meet her gaze. You're right. Keanu, she said, stepping closer. I don't want to be afraid of this anymore. I don't want to keep choosing loneliness because it's easier than loss. I'm tired of rehearsing what life should be. I just want to live it, with someone who gets it, with someone who gets me. His eyes didn't leave hers. I'm here. I've always been here, Sandy, even when we weren't speaking, even when we were continents apart. There's a part of me that never left your door. She didn't speak. She stepped into the blanket beside him, and for the first time since he knocked on her door, she leaned her head on his shoulder and let herself be held. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't a kiss. But it was everything. Because real love, the kind that lasts, isn't always made of loud moments. Sometimes it's made of shared silence, mutual healing, and a porch under the stars. The next morning, something had shifted permanently. They made breakfast like always, but now there was something more in every glance, every smile. They weren't guessing anymore. They were choosing slowly, cautiously, but choosing all the same. That evening, Sandra received a call from her agent. The director wanted to meet. She hesitated. Then she looked at Keanu and asked, "Will you come with me?" Of course. They flew to New York together 3 days later, the first time they had stepped back into the world since the knock. At the meeting, the director, a quiet, intuitive woman in her 30s, explained how she had written the story from her own journey of losing someone and rediscovering life. As she spoke, Keanu and Sandra exchanged glances. This wasn't just a role, it was a mirror. The director paused at one point and said, "I know it's unconventional, but if you're both on board, I'd love to write in a second lead for the male character. Someone who isn't perfect, someone who doesn't save her, someone who just walks with her." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's the only kind of man I know how to play." Back at the hotel that night, Sandra sat on the windowsill looking out over the glowing city. "It's happening again," she whispered. "What is?" Keanu asked from behind her. "We're starting something new, but it feels like coming home." He stepped beside her, brushing her hand. Because maybe home was never a place, maybe it was always a person. And for once, they didn't need to speak anymore. Because some doors don't need to be knocked on again. Once opened, truly opened, they never close again. When the world found out. The snow had started falling in New York when the news broke, gentle at first, like whispers in the wind, then louder, sharper, until it covered everything. A single blurry photo of Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock leaving the small Soho cafe after their meeting with the indie director had ignited a digital wildfire. At first, it was gossip columns speculating about a secret romantic reunion, but within hours, every major entertainment outlet had plastered their names on headlines alongside words like "finally," "unexpected couple," "love rekindled," and "shock romance of the year." It didn't matter that they weren't hiding. It didn't matter that they hadn't said a word. The world had spoken for them. Inside their hotel room on the 13th floor, the noise outside had become deafening. Notifications pinged endlessly on their phones. Emails poured in. Agents called, asking for statements, guidance, control. Paparazzi lined the sidewalk below, angling for the perfect shot. Fans posted long essays online, speculating about every detail, every movement, every smile exchanged between them. And through it all, Sandra sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her screen with wide, anxious eyes, her heart pounding in rhythm she hadn't felt in years. "This is why I ran," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. "This is why I stopped showing up to premieres, why I stopped taking roles, because it doesn't matter what's true, it only matters what they can spin." Keanu, who had been pacing the room, stopped beside her. He didn't try to offer cliches. He didn't tell her to breathe or calm down or ignore it. Instead, he sat next to her and simply placed his hand over hers, grounding her without saying a word. "I know," he said finally. "I've lived it too." She turned to him, searching his face for something steady. "So what do we do now?" He looked at her for a long time, then leaned forward and picked up her phone, gently turning it off. Then he turned off his own. He stood, walked to the window, and pulled the curtains shut, letting the room dim into peace. Then, without asking, he knelt before her, rested his forehead against her knees, and said, "We do what we've always done. We protect what matters." She didn't speak. She just lowered her hand to the back of his neck, holding him there, as if anchoring herself to that moment. Later that night, they ordered room service, grilled vegetables and rice, because it reminded them of Malibu. They didn't talk about the media storm. They talked about nothing and everything. They watched an old black-and-white movie on mute, guessing the dialogue and making each other laugh until tears rolled down their cheeks. But when the world shouts at you long enough, even silence starts to echo. The next morning, their director called. The studio had concerns. They wanted to postpone the announcement of the film. "There's too much noise around you two right now," she said delicately. "They're worried it'll distract from the art." Sandra felt the old bitterness rise in her chest. It was always the same story, the industry that praised you for your vulnerability but panicked the moment you became too real. "Let me guess," she replied coolly. "They'd prefer a younger actress and a safer male lead." The director hesitated. "They didn't say that, but I can feel it." Keanu took the phone gently from her hand. "Tell them we're not ornaments, we're artists, and if they don't believe in the story, we'll find someone who does." After the call ended, Sandra sat back against the headboard and stared at the ceiling. "Do you ever get tired of having to fight for your right to just exist?" "All the time," Keanu said, "but I've learned something." "What?" "That peace isn't found in the absence of noise. It's found in the ability to stay still while it rages." His words hit her harder than he knew. That afternoon they checked out of the hotel, not because they were running, but because they needed air, space, truth. They flew back to California, but not to Los Angeles. Keanu had a small cabin tucked away in Big Sur, hidden among redwoods and cliffs, far from the cameras, far from the expectations. They drove there in silence, holding hands occasionally, the weight of the world resting somewhere between their fingers, heavy but bearable. The cabin was simple: one fireplace, 2 chairs, a record player, no television, no internet, just books, blankets, and windows that framed nothing but nature. It was, as Keanu said, a place where your soul has nothing left to hide behind. And for a few days they lived, truly lived. They hiked trails with no names, they cooked over a fire pit. They made music with makeshift instruments. They danced barefoot on wooden floors. Sandra rediscovered the feeling of waking up without an alarm. Keanu rediscovered the joy of writing letters by hand, and every evening they read aloud poems, scripts, journal entries, even old fan letters. One night, Sandra pulled out the script again. They read the final scene together by candlelight. It ended with 2 characters standing on opposite sides of a threshold, afraid to step forward, afraid to lose themselves in the process. But then one speaks. "If I fall, will you catch me?" The other replies, "No, but I'll fall too, so at least we'll land together." After reading it aloud, Sandra looked up, tears in her eyes. "I want to do it," she whispered. "The film, not because it's a comeback, not because they think it's smart marketing. I want to do it because it's the first story that feels like mine." Keanu reached over, took her hand. "Then let's tell it our way." Over the next few weeks, the media storm faded. A new scandal, a new rumor, a new starlet, the world always found something else to shout about. And in the quiet that followed, Keanu and Sandra made a decision. They would produce the film independently. No studio, no PR machine, just heart, truth, and their own terms. They assembled a small team of passionate artists, a cinematographer who had shot documentaries in war zones, a costume designer who had retired to care for her aging father, a music composer who believed in healing through sound. It wasn't a production. It was a mission. As the prep began, Sandra returned to Malibu to be with her children. Keanu stayed in Big Sur, finalizing logistics. They talked every night, not with pressure, not with need, but with the ease of 2 people who had stopped pretending they weren't each other's home. And then one evening, Sandra sent him a voice message. Her voice was soft, slightly breathless. "I was watching our old interviews today, from back when we did Speed. We were so young, so open. I saw the way you looked at me, and I realized something. You've always looked at me that way, and I think I've always known. I was just too scared to believe it could be real." "I'm not scared anymore." Keanu didn't reply immediately. He listened to the message over and over, then walked to the desk in the cabin, opened the drawer, and took out the letter he had written but never sent. The one he had typed the night he decided to stay. He printed it, folded it carefully, and wrote on the front, "To be opened when you need to remember who you are." The next morning, he mailed it. They weren't together every minute. They didn't need to be. Because now, even when apart, they carried each other in ways that no headline could distort, no studio could manipulate, and no time could erase. It wasn't a romance born of spectacle. It was a quiet unfolding, a patient blooming, a knock on a door that was never supposed to be answered, and yet changed everything once it was. And though the world still whispered, speculated, and waited for their official statement, Keanu and Sandra didn't owe the world anything. They had already given each other everything. The premiere that didn't need a red carpet. The sound of applause was faint, almost distant, as though echoing from a parallel world. Keanu Reeves stood at the back of the small, independent theater in Santa Monica, his frame cloaked in quiet observation as the final credits rolled on-screen. Sandra Bullock sat in the second row beside her children, hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on the fading light of the screen. There were no paparazzi, no velvet ropes. No designer gowns or tuxedos or long speeches filled with polished industry metaphors. Just people, a few hundred of them, all there to witness something that had been born not of business but of bravery. The film, titled Thresholds, had taken only 4 months to complete. Shot on a modest budget and a humble crew, it didn't need spectacle to move people. It told the story of 2 individuals who had lived through grief, fame, loneliness, and rediscovery, and who ultimately chose to walk together through the messiness of life without trying to clean it up for the world. The performances were raw, unscripted in places, infused with glances, silences, and lines that could never be manufactured in a studio. The audience had wept, laughed, and at times simply sat still in reverence. And now, as the room returned to light, a rare kind of silence lingered, not awkward, not empty, but sacred. Keanu didn't move right away. He let the others rise. He watched as Sandra hugged the crew, thanked the projectionist, and bent down to kiss her daughter on the forehead. There was something different about her now. The same woman but reassembled, not rebuilt like something broken, but rearranged like something rediscovered. When their eyes finally met across the aisle, Keanu smiled. Not the actor's smile, not the press tour smile, but the quiet smile of a man who had finally found peace in presence. They didn't walk toward each other immediately. Instead, Sandra approached the stage, microphone in hand. She looked out at the crowd and began to speak, her voice unshaking, her heart on full display. "I've spent the last few years of my life hiding," she began. "Not just from cameras or headlines or the pressure to be on, but from myself. I thought I had to be strong by being silent, that if I showed the cracks, people would stop believing in me. But what I've learned from this story, from this journey, and especially from the person sitting in the back of this room, is that strength doesn't mean silence. It means showing up anyway, even when your heart is trembling. Even when you've lost more than you thought you could survive." She paused, tears in her eyes. "This film isn't about characters, it's about real life, about second chances, about what happens when someone knocks on your door and you actually answer." The room erupted in applause, not the polite kind, the kind that makes people stand, the kind that makes grown men cry, the kind that only happens when everyone in the room recognizes truth and honors it. Keanu stepped forward then without a word. When he reached the stage, he didn't take the mic. He simply took her hand. And for the first time in front of the world, or at least the small piece of it that truly mattered, they stood together. Not as actors, not as public figures, but as 2 people who had walked through fire and chose every day to keep walking together. Later that night, after the last guests had gone and the theater stood empty once more, Keanu and Sandra sat on the stage with their shoes off, eating leftover takeout from cardboard boxes, and listening to a scratched vinyl record they'd found in the projectionist's booth. The theater lights dimmed slowly around them. The outside world was still there, probably already spinning theories, dissecting their words, analyzing every glance and touch, but none of it mattered now. "I keep thinking about your letter," Sandra said suddenly. Keanu looked at her, a bit surprised. "You read it?" he asked. She nodded. "After I got back to Malibu, I waited until the kids were asleep. I lit a candle, and I read every word out loud." He didn't say anything. "I cried," she continued. "Not because it was romantic, not because it was poetic, but because it was real. You didn't try to fix me in it. You didn't offer solutions. You just said you'd stay, that you'd fall with me, not for me." Keanu reached out and brushed a lock of hair behind her ear. "I meant every word." Sandra leaned her head against his shoulder. "And I believed every word. For the first time, I believed someone could love me and not run when the storms came." He kissed the top of her head. The silence between them returned, not empty but whole. Weeks passed, then months. The film began to circulate in indie festivals, slowly picking up critical acclaim. The reviews weren't just glowing, they were reverent. Critics wrote of the film as a miracle in minimalism, a masterclass in emotional realism, and a story that didn't demand attention but deserved it. But more importantly, the letters started pouring in. Not from producers or celebrities, but from strangers, a woman in hospice care who said the film gave her peace, a teenager battling depression who said it made him feel seen, a widower who said he finally wept for the first time in 10 years. Keanu and Sandra read every single one. They never responded as stars, only as people, as two souls who understood pain and chose to alchemize it into hope. Eventually, Hollywood came calling again. Big studios, massive offers, interview requests, magazine features, but they declined most, not out of arrogance but alignment. They weren't chasing anything anymore. They were building, slowly, intentionally, quietly. Sandra returned to writing, something she hadn't done in years. A memoir, but not about fame, about motherhood, about fear, about healing. Keanu spent time at his cabin mentoring young filmmakers, encouraging stories that hadn't yet been given permission to be told. They traveled, not to escape, but to experience. They visited libraries in small towns, volunteered at shelters, ate in diners no one would ever photograph, and everywhere they went, they carried a truth that no headline could contain. The greatest stories are never the ones that begin with noise, but the ones that begin with a knock. Years later, on a warm spring afternoon in Malibu, Sandra opened the front door of the same coastal house where it had all begun. Her daughter stood beside her, now in her teens, holding a camera and preparing to film a school project about Mom's favorite memory. Sandra laughed. "You're really making me do this." "Come on," her daughter said. "You promised." Sandra stepped back and let the camera roll. "Okay. My favorite memory was the day someone knocked on my door. I didn't know it at the time, but everything in my life was waiting for that sound." She paused, and when I opened it, the rest of my life walked in. Just then, Keanu stepped into frame, holding a tray of tea and cookies. He raised an eyebrow. "Am I interrupting?" Sandra smiled. "No, you're right on time." And somewhere in the background, the ocean kept breathing. The waves still came and went. Life kept moving. But for them, for the two souls who dared to stop, to feel, to heal, time had found a different rhythm. Not the rhythm of fame, or fear, or escape, but the rhythm of peace, of presence, of a love that didn't arrive with fireworks, but with a knock.